Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, survivors of the earthquake in Morocco face an uncertain future as the country continues to assess the extent of the damage caused by a disaster that claimed down 3,000 lives. Also, the death toll from the flooding that wiped out whole areas of the Libyan city of Derna tops 11,300. Criticism of authorities' response to the storm that triggered the disaster mounts. Some imposed a curfew ahead of the storm rather than evacuating. And parts of Nigeria are plunged into darkness as the country's power grid suffers a total system collapse. The erratic supply is a huge drag on the continent's top economy. But first, Morocco said that it will fund emergency relief and feature a building of around 50,000 homes destroyed by last week's massive earthquake. Many of the displaced are living in temporary accommodation, even tents, and are worried about what they'll do when autumn temperatures drop. The future remains uncertain. Officials say it could take over half a decade to rebuild some of the communities around the epicenter of the quake in the High Atlas. For now, though, efforts are still focused on immediate humanitarian needs. At least 2,946 people were killed. Many more were injured. Infrastructure's been gutted, and limited access to electricity and safe drinking water pose profound health risks.
Scenes of devastation in Targa, in Morocco's Atlas Mountains.
And you can see now no water, no life, no nothing.
Abdel Ghafour is only 19. Two of his relatives died right here. Days later, there's rubble everywhere. Broken pipes litter the ground, as well as electric cables.
Not electricity now, and we need now electricity to charge our phone, to use the phone to call someone, and maybe 991.
With no electricity or water, life has become unbearable. People are only able to cope thanks to donations of bottled water. But this situation is untenable.
If this finish, we're not cocaine or if someone thirsty doesn't have water to drink.
In Iselda, a village nearby, houses are still standing, but residents are too scared to go back. Instead, they're staying in these tents, and their only access to drinking water is this one tap.
Move over, Malik. Move.
We take turns to get water, but it's difficult because now we all have to come here.
Each drop is rationed, but still, it's far from enough.
We've asked the authorities to install a water tank. These children haven't had a wash since Friday.
People are forced to make do with the little they have. Like here, in this makeshift kitchen.
It's dangerous, but we don't have a choice. The floor is wet. We make the kids go outside so they don't get burnt.
A little further away, residents have been hanging their laundry on electric cables.
We took the cable from the house next door and we plugged it in. At night, we cover it with this plastic bag in case it rains.
The greatest fear now is the onset of winter and waterborne diseases.
Tunisia has stopped a delegation from the European Parliament from entering the country after EU lawmakers criticised a migration deal between Tunis and Brussels. Legislators from the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee were due to conduct a fact-finding mission, but were refused entry. In a debate earlier this week, MEPs on the left had slammed Brussels' promise of potentially hundreds of millions of euros of support for Tunis in exchange for a crackdown on irregular migration. Critics have accused the EU of striking a deal with an increasingly authoritarian government. And there were blackouts across Nigeria on Thursday as its power grid suffered a total system collapse. The national power supply is often erratic, which is a huge drag on the continent's top economy. Our Sam Olakoya tells us more.
Authorities blame the nationwide blackout on a fire incident which affected distribution of electricity around the country. Even as authorities say power is being restored, the nationwide power failure highlights Nigeria's electricity supply problems. Nigeria faces frequent power failures. Occasionally, the entire country is left without power. Nigeria requires 30,000 megawatts of electricity daily, but at best of times, the country is only able to generate 4,000 megawatts. Nigeria is unable to generate its electricity requirement due in part to inadequate maintenance of power plants and low investment in the power sector. The shortfall in power supply comes at a huge cost for Africa's largest economy. In the face of the power shortage, many industries and other businesses do not rely on public power supply. Rather, they rely on the more expensive option of using electricity generators. This has substantially increased the cost of doing business in Nigeria. The high cost of power has forced many manufacturing companies to shut down as the prices of their products are far higher than imported ones.
Samuel Okoye there for us. Now, the death toll in Derna, the Libyan city worst hit by the massive flooding that swept through parts of the east of the country at the start of the week, has risen to 11,300. Authorities had previously put that number at 5,500. A decade of instability has contributed to the crisis, and local authorities who imposed a curfew ahead of the storm rather than evacuating have come under fire. Oliver Farrow tells us more.
Derna is still in shock after massive flooding that all but destroyed this city in the east of Libya. On Sunday night, Storm Daniel struck, and when two upstream dams burst, they unleashed what residents described as a tsunami on the city. Like many others, this man has been unable to locate his relatives, for whom he fears the worst.
It's a disaster beyond our imagination. We thought it was just floods, that the water would go down, but the mud is the greatest problem. Bodies are buried under piles of mud and debris, 3 or 4 meters of mud.
These Sudanese migrant workers were woken by a loud bang at about 3 a.m. on Monday and described the horror of what they saw as the waters rose.
First of all, there are around 14 or 15 families that were swept away by the sea. Anyone who was in the valley was swept away. 9 other people who live directly on the coast are gone. May they rest in peace.
The floods have cast into cold light the damage wrought by a decade of instability in Libya, which continues to be ruled by rival governments based in the west and east of the country. This has left Libya sorely unprepared for such storms, according to the World Meteorological Organization.
Since the security situation in the country is so difficult, it's difficult to go there and improve the situation. And the Met service is practically not functioning. The flooding event just came there, and there was no evacuation taking place because there was not the proper early warning services in place.
Critics are already castigating authorities in the east for their alleged negligence in maintaining the 2 dams and for failing to evacuate regions at risk ahead of the storm.
For more on this, I'm joined by Libyan analyst Jalal Hashawi. Jalal, thanks so much for coming in. Now, we heard in that report there some of the criticisms that's being levelled against Libyan authorities for not having basically pulled things together in advance of the storm in order to mitigate some of the damage that we're seeing now. We've seen, now the country's been through like a decade of political instability, political rivalry, violence. At a time of so much pain, some of this criticism about the actions of officials has seen the government in Tripoli recommending that the Attorney General investigate the disaster. But bearing in mind the context, the political context, do you think that the country's in any position to do anything about any insight that may come from such an investigation?
Mm-hmm. First of all, there's going to be also a request for an international investigation, and the event itself is so big, nobody will forget. So I'm hopeful that the investigation, at least the domestic one, will actually occur. Mm-hmm. And I think, people will not forget. And this is like a Hiroshima-type event. Mm-hmm. And years from now, people will still be asking questions and looking for answers.
Do you think that political divisions can be overcome in order to mount some kind of coherent, coordinated response?
Well, first of all, Libya cannot do much, so them coordinating doesn't necessarily is not going to make a big difference. But what we're seeing right now is that indeed the division between West and East is already being overcome, but that's bad news because it means that the family that dominates Tripoli and the family that dominates Benghazi those two are going to basically establish a modus vivendi in order to use the disaster to stay in power. Remember what the UN was trying to push for just before the tragedy was for elections. Elections mean that the incumbents leave. Now they're going to use that to stay in power. And they're going to show a lot of mutual love in that interest, with that interest in mind. And that's very cynical, but that is what is already happening.
Well, what do you mean they're going to show mutual love?
You're going to see a visit from the Prime Minister in the West, in the East, and they're going to work more closely together. And the ulterior motive will be for them to actually kill the elections plan and stay longer.
So in the short term, you're saying that in terms of the specific response to the disaster, that very much is still very much reliant on international help. But in the long term, you think that this will actually deepen divisions?
It's going to potentially create problems in the East, but the international aid needs the local authorities in order to unfold. It needs a local presence and authorities in Tripoli and authorities in Benghazi for the internationals to be able to do their work. And the incumbents are going to use that as an excuse to entrench themselves even further in power.
So even in a situation as devastating and as apocalyptic as this, the political divisions and rivalries you believe will continue to take precedent over the immediate humanitarian.
We're going to see a cynical use of this disaster by the people in power.
Well, we hope for the sake of those at the front lines of the damage that you're wrong. But thank you so much for your insight, Jalal. That is, though, unfortunately, all we have time for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for your time. Join us again if you can. Take care.